15 budget for Grey Eminence, the next dev diary for the game. So this is obviously all about your country's budget, how it gets revenues, how it gets expenses, and how that's going to work in the game. This one, unlike the previous two dev diaries, which have also been money focused, is the as they mention here, the system that you'll have to interact with at least some way. They have said other ones you can kind of leave automated if you want to, and if you don't want to dive into them, they will generally run themselves to a varying degree. Whereas this one, obviously, you do want to interact with, because you could run out of money if you don't if you don't amend your budget. You're probably not going to have a good time. But they do show here that although you will have to interact with this during your campaigns, it's not the hardest system to follow. If you've played any kind of grand strategy game, you've seen this kind of system before. So it's nothing too complicated, and it should be pretty easy for everyone to kind of follow how it's going to work. But anyway, let's get into it. So they're first going to talk about revenues. Running a country takes money, and the money usually has to come from somewhere, although it doesn't always. They will talk about that later on. There are various sources of revenue which a country might fund itself. So let's start with a breakdown of the major ones. As the saying goes, nothing is certain except for death and taxes. This applies as much to the real world as it does in Grey Eminence, where taxation is the cornerstone of revenues for the most states throughout the game's timeline. We'll go into great detail about the various types and flavors of taxation in a later dev diary dedicated to taxation, but for now we'll give you a breakdown of the three major tax categories: direct taxes, consumption taxes, and excise taxes. So yeah, there's already going to be a bit of information here about tax, but there is also going to be a dev diary specifically about taxation, so that's going to be good to see. Because they kind of skim over how they work here, but obviously a bit more information would be great. Direct taxes are the primary taxes your country collects from its entire populace. Their exact nature depends on your country's tax laws. They might come from a poll tax or an income tax, for example. Unlike direct taxes, which are levied directly on the population, consumption and excise taxes are levied on transactions, consumption for consumption taxes and production for excise taxes. They allow you to target specific parts of the economy for raising revenue, allowing for more precise intervention. For example, if your country has a strong domestic alcohol industry, an alcohol excise would raise quite a bit of money without placing an undue burden on the general population. Although I would imagine the alcohol industry would not be pleased about that, so there is probably a trade-off still in that case. You can raise money specifically from one industry, but I would imagine that industry is not going to be happy about it, and maybe they'll move elsewhere, or maybe they do push discontent on the wider populace. It'd be interesting to see how that does work, because obviously you can't just focus like, oh, we have a lot of alcohol, let's just tax them crazy amounts of money and there'll be no repercussions for that. It'd be interesting to see what those repercussions would be, and it's probably covered in the taxation dev diary coming in the future. Like most other sources of revenue, the level of taxation in your country can be configured. This affects all three types of taxation. There are 4 levels which you can choose from: none, low, medium, and high. Any level of taxation beyond none will generate a certain level of discontent, which can eventually lead to rebellions and revolutions, though high taxes alone are usually insufficient to cause an uprising. I would imagine if you have it on high for everything, and then you've got some other discontent happening for some other reason, it kind of compounds those issues. If you've got high taxation, but you're doing really well, and everyone's rich, I guess maybe they don't mind as much. If everyone's poor and you're still taxing them high, I imagine not as happy, but again, we'll see more in the future. Another major source of revenue from your country are the elites. As we've discussed previously, every country has their various power holders, the nobility, clergy, and merchants, whose internal machinations can greatly bolster or hinder your efforts. They can own vast estates and might even be wealthier than their host country, but luckily, they can also be taxed. So, you have a lot of rich people in there, but, if you're taxing them, does it really matter as much? Well, yes, because they can affect you in other ways. This acts as an income tax on their income, not revenue, from all buildings they own. The dues of this elite type can be configured separately but apply equally to all members of that elite. Like regular taxation, there are 4 levels to choose from, any beyond none generating increasing amounts of favours for the elite characters, which they will try and force concessions from you. So yeah, it doesn't create discontent exactly with the elites, but anything higher than none, you owe them favours. It will be interesting to see what those favours do. Like, can they force you to, I guess, change laws that help them more, I would imagine. Maybe they can even try and push you to maybe declare war against somebody who is contrary to their goals. Be interesting to see. Like I say, in the future, we'll obviously get more information on that. But because imagine you want it higher than none quite often, I would think. So you are getting a good amount of money from them. But obviously, it depends what kind of concessions you have to give. Like I say, I would imagine it's maybe less levies in the early game, and then some kind of law change to give them more power, I would imagine, in the future. Maybe a parliament or something like that. Who knows? A third revenue source is tariffs. We won't go into much detail here. There's going to be a full dev diary on trade. Well, that'd be good to read. But in short, whenever your country imports or exports goods, a fee can be imposed. This is a dual purpose of raising revenue for the country and impacting the profitability of tariff trade routes, which can result in alternative routes emerging. Tariffs too can be configured along the 4 levels we've shown before. So tariffs, it will be interesting to see the full details in that trade dev diary, because obviously historically tariffs on goods have been a way a country has kind of imposed its power on other places. Maybe you're one of the only places that, you know, not realistic example, but maybe you're the only place that builds ships that are good. If you imposed a massive export tariff on them, you'd make them proportionally way more expensive for every other country than it actually cost you to make and use them yourself. So you'd obviously have a massive advantage in that field compared to everyone else. Obviously, that's a bit of an extreme, non-realistic example, but you know, you could think of it smaller in different ways that you could affect other nations by tariffing or not certain items. So again, it'd be interesting to see in the future dev diaries how that's going to work. One final source of revenue is minting. It's the only source of revenue that truly appears out of nothing, representing the minting of new coins or printing new notes. Minting is closely tied to the game's inflation mechanic, just like in real life. You know, money printer go burr, inflation happens. So yeah, pretty obvious that one. If you print money, inflation happens. And here we go, the UI for the revenues. So this is the Free City of Hamburg in HRE. Just saying they're quite a small, got an efficient economy, efficient bureaucracy, so they actually do quite well for themselves proportionally to larger realms. So you can see the direct taxes, sales, and the excise taxes, and then obviously the taxes on all the different kinds of elites, making quite a bit of money from the merchants because they are a port. So that's obviously where they're making the bulk of their money. A little bit of minting, so they are printing a little bit of money for that tiny bit of inflation and just, you know, some nice income. Subjects, obviously they don't have a subject, so they're only small, but if you're a large nation, you would do. War reparations, I guess plus or negative, depending if you're paying them or receiving them. Same foreign subsidies, I guess if you're paying subsidies to someone else or you're receiving them. And then looting isn't covered in this, but I imagine, you know, if you're, especially early in the game, you can loot people, I would imagine, you know, in some ships and go sailing and steal some money. So kind of funny to see it in the like official budget. This year we're budgeting 2 gold for looting. Please bring back some gold. So yeah, pretty obvious. Quite a nice UI, shows you everything you need to do. As I've said before, UI probably takes a pass quite near the end of the game development, so I imagine this will change nearer the time, but I mean, it looks functional now. Shows you everything you need to know, so you know, can't complain too much. Expenses. The reason a country levels taxes and brings in revenue is to pay for its expenses. These are functions that justify the state's existence and through which you, the player, can exert influence over the rest of the game. The 3 areas are military, bureaucracy, and construction. Maintaining a strong military is the utmost importance to most countries and is usually the only thing preventing them from being conquered by others. Unfortunately, armies, and especially navies, aren't cheap. They consume a lot of goods and don't generate any revenue directly, except for looting, but that's a different topic. So again, we'll get a dev diary on looting, I imagine, in the future. Yet they're an unavoidable expense under most circumstances, so most countries will have to come to terms with the fact that the majority of their budget will go towards the military. So yeah, I mean, most countries will need a military to protect themselves. I imagine, funnily enough, the example they gave of Hamburg is part of the HRE. So actually, I think they show it later on. Yeah, they do pay for an army, but as they're part of the HRE, I imagine you probably need a smaller army than if you're independent, because obviously the HRE will help protect you if you get attacked. Whereas, you know, if you're just like a tiny nation all on your own, probably need a higher military budget because you're the only people defending yourself, except for alliances and stuff like that. But yeah, I can imagine you can save a bit if you're part of a larger realm directly. So yeah, I think that's generally what it's talking about. While cutting back on goods isn't possible, cutting military wages is. Unfortunately, their wages can be 0. So unlike revenues, there are only 3 levels, low, medium, and high. Cutting wages will obviously have a negative impact on morale, more on a future dev diary on war, which will be fantastic to see actually, because we haven't seen how war is going to work in this game. We've discussed it in, I think, the last dev diary discussion that we had. Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how war actually works in the game, so hopefully that dev diary is soon. But it will make a burden of military costs slightly more bearable. This works exactly like if you played EU4, it'll work, I think, exactly like that. You know, if you have lower wages, then morale will be less, so obviously you're going to not do as well in battle, but maybe if you're at peace, you can pay them a little bit less, and then when you're coming up to war, pay them a bit more. So kind of the fine balanced or dance that you have to do to kind of keep them happy but keep it bearable. But yeah, it looks like that's roughly how that's going to work. Another mandatory expense for almost all states is bureaucracy. This is the bottom of the state, which through all its functions are exercised. So keeping it well funded is a good idea. So yeah, obviously, helping your realm actually work. If you don't pay enough, as it says here, if you don't pay enough bureaucracy to keep it functioning well, you will get corruption happening. Because obviously it's not running as well as it should. People are taking advantage of you not funding everything well. But also, at the beginning of the game, bureaucracies aren't as big. In the 1900s, no, the 900s, 1000, 1000 AD, that's a terrible way. The 10th and 11th century, that's a much better way of saying that. And bureaucracies weren't as big, really, were they? There was just a king and his nobles, they gave him money and all that kind of stuff, whereas obviously coming into like 18th, 19th century, bureaucracies became much bigger as countries became more complicated to run. So as the game progresses, you will see this obviously change, get more expensive as you go on, but obviously you'll get more benefit from your country running better. So kind of a one thing there. And the last expense we'll mention today is construction. Unless you plan on leaving your economy on autopilot, aka in the hands of the elites, which should be clear is a perfectly viable option in our optional complexity game design, you'll eventually want to construct new buildings or to expand existing ones. This means paying for construction materials, including the logistics of getting the goods to the site, and then paying for the construction workers. Modifying their wages affects construction speed, so you can decide whether or not time or money is more valuable to you. So this is the only one I'm not sure about in here in expenses. I think the other ones make sense, bureaucracy and military, but construction as just an expense like this, I'm not sure about this. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Modifying construction speed and things should be buildings, something like on the map, rather than just being like, oh, well, I'm not building anything. I'll just put low wages. And then when I'm building something, I'll put it on high wages because then it'll be faster. I'm not sure about it being so easy to flip between things. I can be convinced, but I'm not sure it being just a cost that you have that you can just change at a whim for construction. It seems a little bit odd. But maybe that's just me. Yeah, maybe that's just me. The other ones make sense, but having construction like this, I'm not sure about. But like I said, we'll see. It might work out quite well. But that is going to be it for today. The Dev Diary, like I say, pretty short. But yeah, we're going to leave it there for today. They obviously talk about modability. As I always say, they're making the game very moddable, so you can make a lot of changes and obviously use this system elsewhere. So yeah, they're going to talk about that. They're also saying the game is actually progressing quite well, actually, after the last few Dev Diaries where they said they were having obviously funding issues, but it sounded like. And they say in the new year, everything's going to be back up to speed. So, yeah, be interesting to see what kind of progress we see next year. Well, the next Dev Diary is on November the 5th, so it'll be interesting to see which one that is. We've had a lot of money-focused ones. I really want that war one or a map one. So we'll see what that one is in not too long. But yeah, if you've enjoyed the video today, hit that like button. Helps me know that people enjoy watching these and helps other people find these Dev Diaries and content in the future. And if you're new here and this is your first video, I've covered all the Dev Diaries so far, so I do have a playlist if you want to catch up on everything. But yeah, if you subscribe, I obviously cover Grey Eminence and then other grand strategy games on the channel, so hit subscribe. But for now, we're going to leave it there for today, and I'll see you in the next one.